Chapter 2. How Africa Developed Before the Coming of the Europeans, up to the 15th century. Before even the British came into relations with our people, we were a developed people, having our own institutions, having our own ideas of government. J. E. Casely Hayford, 1922. African Gold Coast Nationalist. A general overview. It has been shown that, using comparative standards, Africa today is underdeveloped in relation to Western Europe and a few other parts of the world, and that the present position has been arrived at not by the separate evolution of Africa on the one hand and Europe on the other, but through exploitation. As is well known, Africa has had prolonged and extensive contact with Europe, and one has to bear in mind that contact between different societies changes their respective rates of development. To set the record straight, 4 operations are required. 1. Reconstruction of the nature of development in Africa before the coming of Europeans. 2. Reconstruction of the nature of development which took place in Europe before expansion abroad. 3. Analysis of Africa's contribution to Europe's present developed state. 4. Analysis of Europe's contribution to Africa's present underdeveloped state. The second task has already been extensively carried out in European literature, and only passing references need be made, but the others are all deserving of further attention. The African continent reveals very fully the workings of the law of uneven development of societies. There are marked contrasts between the Ethiopian Empire and the hunting groups of pygmies in the Congo forest, or between the empires of the Western Sudan and the Khoisan hunter-gatherers of the Kalahari Desert. Indeed, there were striking contrasts within any given geographical area. The Ethiopian Empire embraced literate feudal Amharic noblemen, as well as simple Kaffa cultivators and Gala pastoralists. The empires of the Western Sudan had sophisticated, educated Mandinga townsmen, small communities of Bozo fishermen, and nomadic Fulani herdsmen. Even among clans and lineages that appear roughly similar, there were considerable differences. However, it is possible to distinguish between what was uniquely African and what was universal in the sense of being characteristic of all human societies at a given stage of development. It is also essential to recognize the process of dialectical evolution from lower to higher forms of social organization. And in looking at the most advanced social formations, one would appreciate the potential of the continent as a whole and the direction of change. The moment that the topic of the pro-European African past is raised, many individuals are concerned for various reasons to know about the existence of the African civilizations. Mainly this stems from a desire to make comparisons with European civilizations. This is not the context in which to evaluate the so-called civilizations of Europe. It is enough to note that behavior of European capitalists from the epoch of slavery through colonialism, fascism, and genocidal wars in Asia and Africa. Such barbarism causes suspicion to attach to the use of the word civilization to describe Western Europe and North America. As far as Africa is concerned during the period of early development, it is preferable to speak in terms of cultures rather than civilizations. A culture is a total way of life. It embraces what people ate and what they wore, the way they walked and the way they talked, the manner in which they treated death and greeted the newborn. Obviously, unique features came into existence in virtually every locality with regard to all social details. In addition, the continent of Africa, south of the Great Sahara Desert, formed a broad community where resemblances were clearly discernible. For example, music and dance had key roles in uncontaminated African society. They were ever present at birth, initiation, marriage, death, as well as at times of recreation. Africa is the continent of drums and percussion. African peoples reached the pinnacle of achievement in that sphere. Because of the impact of colonialism and cultural imperialism, which will be discussed later, Europeans and Africans themselves in the colonial period lacked due regard for the unique features of African culture. Those features have a value of their own that cannot be eclipsed by European culture either in the comparable period before 1500 or in the subsequent centuries. They cannot be eclipsed because they are not really comparable phenomena. Who in this world is competent to judge whether an Austrian waltz is better than a Wakande ngoma? Furthermore, even in those spheres of culture that are more readily comparable, such as the fine arts, it is known that African achievements of the pre-European period stand as contributions to man's heritage of beautiful creations. The art of Egypt, the Sudan, and Ethiopia was well known to the rest of the world at an early date. That of the rest of Africa is still being discovered and rediscovered by Europeans and present-day Africans. The verdict of art historians on the Ife and Benin bronzes is well known. Since they date from the 14th and 15th centuries, they are very relevant to any discussion of African development in the epoch before the contacts with Europe. Nor should they be regarded as unusual, except with regard to the material in which the sculptures were executed. The same skill and feeling obviously went into sculpture and artwork in non-durable materials, especially wood. African dance and art were almost invariably linked with a religious world outlook in one way or another. As is well known, traditional African religious practices exist in great variety, and it should also be remembered that both Islam and Christianity found homes on the African continent almost from their very inception. The features of the traditional African religions help to set African cultures apart from those in other continents, but in this present context, it is more important to note how much African religion had in common with religion elsewhere, and how this can be used as an index to the level of development in Africa before European impact in the 15th century. Religion is an aspect of the superstructure of a society, deriving ultimately from the degree of control and understanding of the material world. However, when man thinks in religious terms, he starts from the ideal rather than with the material world, which is beyond his comprehension. This creates a non-scientific and metaphysical way of viewing the world, which often conflicts with the scientific materialist outlook and with the development of society. African ancestral religions were no better or worse than other religions as such, but by the end of feudalism, Europeans began to narrow the area of human life in which religion and the church played a part. Religion ceased to dominate politics, geography, medicine. To free those things from religious restraints, it had to be argued that religion had its own sphere, and the things of this world had their own secular sphere. This secularization of life speeded up the development of capitalism and later socialism. In contrast, the period before the coming of the whites, religion pervaded African life just as it pervaded life in other pre-feudal societies, such as those of the Maoris of Australia, or the Afghans of Afghanistan, or the Vikings of Scandinavia. Religion can play both a positive and a negative role as an aspect of the superstructure. In most instances in early Africa, religious beliefs were associated with the mobilization and discipline of large numbers of people to form states. In a few instances, religion also provided concepts in the struggle for social justice. The negative aspects usually arose out of the tendency of religion to persist unchanged for extremely long periods, especially when the technology of earning a living changes very slowly. This was the case in African societies, as in all other pre-capitalist societies. At the same time, the religious beliefs themselves react upon the mode of production, further slowing up progress in that respect. For instance, belief in prayer and in the intervention of ancestors and various gods could easily be a substitute for innovations designed to control the impact of weather and environment. The same kind of two-sided relationship also exists between the means of earning a living and the social patterns that arise in the process of work. In Africa, before the 15th century, the predominant principle of social relations was that of family and kinship, associated with communalism. Every member of an African society had his position defined in terms of relatives on his mother's side and on his father's side. Some societies placed greater importance on matrilineal ties and others on patrilineal ties. Those things were crucial to the daily existence of a member of an African society because land, the major means of production, was owned by groups such as the family or clan, the head of which were parents and those yet unborn. In theory, this pattern was explained by saying that the residents in any community were all direct descendants of the first person who settled the land. When a new group arrived, They often made a pretense that they, too, had ancestry dating back to the settling of the land, or else they ensured that members of the earliest kin groups continued to perform the ceremonies related to the land and water of the region. Similarly, the labor that worked the land was generally recruited on a family basis. A single family or household would till its own plots, and it would also be available to share certain joint farming activities with other members of the extended family or clan. Annual hunts and river fishing were also organized by a whole extended family or village community. In a matrilineal society such as that of the Bimba, Zambia, the bridegroom spent a number of years working for the father of his bride, and many young men who had married daughters of the same household often formed work teams to help each other. In Dahomey, a young man did not go to live with his wife's family, but the dokpwe, or work team, allowed a son to participate in carrying out a task of some magnitude for the father of his wife. In both of those examples, the right of the father-in-law to acquire labor and the obligations of the son-in-law to give labor were based on kinship. This can be contrasted with capitalism, where money buys labor, and with feudalism, where the serf provides labor in order to have access to a portion of land which belongs to the landlord. Having been produced on land that was family property and through family labor, the resultant crops and other goods were distributed on the basis of kinship ties. If a man's crops were destroyed by some sudden calamity, relatives in his own village helped him. If the whole community was in distress, people moved to live with their kinsmen in another area where food was not scarce. In Akan country, Ghana, the clan system was highly organized, so that a man from Brong could visit Fonte many hundred miles away and receive food and hospitality from a complete stranger who happened to be of his own clan. Numerous examples could be brought forward to show the dominance of the family principle in the communal phase of African development. It affected the two principal factors of production, land and labor, as well as the system of distributing goods. European anthropologists who have studied African societies have done so mainly from a very prejudiced and racist position, but their researchers can nevertheless provide abundant facts relating to family homesteads and compounds, to the extended family, including affinal members who join by association rather than by birth, and to lineages and clans, which carried the principles of kinship alliances over large areas. However, while the exact details might have differed, similar social institutions were to be found among the Gauls of 11th century France, among the Viet of Indochina at the same date, and virtually everywhere else in the world at one time or another, because communalism is one phase through which all human society passed. In all African societies during the early epoch, the individual at every stage of life had a series of duties and obligations to others in the society, as well as a set of rights, namely, things that he or she could expect or demand from other individuals. Age was a most important factor determining the extent of rights and obligations. The oldest members of the society were highly respected and usually in authority, and the idea of seniority through age was reflected in the presence of age grades and age sets in a great many African societies. Circumcision meant initiation into the society and into adulthood. From that moment, a man was placed with others in his own age group, and a woman likewise. Usually, there were at least 3 age grades, corresponding roughly to the young, the middle-aged, and the old. In large parts of Europe, when communalism broke down, it gave way to widespread slavery as the new form in which labor was mobilized. This slavery continued throughout the European Middle Ages, with the Crusades between Christians and Muslims giving an added excuse for enslaving people. Slavery, in turn, gave way to serfdom, whereby the laborer was tied to the land and could no longer be sold and transported. Because it took many years for the transition from slavery to feudalism to take place in Europe, it was common to find that feudal society still retained numbers of slaves. Parts of China, Burma, and India also had considerable numbers of slaves as the society moved away from elementary communalism, but there was never any time span when slavery was the dominant mode of production in Asia. In Africa, there were few slaves, and there was certainly no epoch of slavery. Most of the slaves were in North African and other Muslim societies, and in those instances a man and his family could have the same slave status for generations within the overall feudal structure of the society. Elsewhere in Africa, communal societies were introduced to the concept of owning alien human beings when they took captives in war. At first, those captives were in a very disadvantaged position, comparable to that of slaves. But very rapidly, captives or their offspring became ordinary members of the society, because there was no scope for the perpetual exploitation of a man by man in a context that was neither feudal nor capitalist. Both Marxists and non-Marxists alike, with different motivations, have pointed out that the sequence of modes of production noted in Europe were not reproduced in Africa. In Africa, after the communal stage, there was no epoch of slavery arising out of the internal evolution, nor was there a mode of production which was the replica of European feudalism. Marx himself recognized that the stages of development in Asia had produced a form of society which could not easily be fitted into a European slot. That he called the Asian mode of production. Following along those lines, a number of Marxists have recently been discussing whether Africa was in the same category as Asia, or whether Africa had its own African mode of production. The implications of the arguments are very progressive, because they are concerned with the concrete conditions of Africa rather than with preconceptions brought from Europe. But the scholars concerned seem to be bent on finding a single term to cover a variety of social formations which were existing in Africa from about the 5th century A.D., to the coming of colonialism. The assumption that will underlie this study is that most African societies before 1500 were in a transitional stage between the practice of agriculture, plus fishing and herding, in family communities, and the practice of the same activities within states and societies comparable to feudalism. In a sense, all history is transition from one stage to another, but some historical situations along the line have more clearly distinguishable characteristics than others. Thus, under communalism, there were no classes, and there was equal access to land, and equality in distribution, at a low level of technology and production. Feudalism involved great inequality in distribution of land and social products. The landlord class and its bureaucracy controlled the state and used it as an instrument for oppressing peasants, serfs, slaves, and even craftsmen and merchants. The movement from communalism to feudalism in every continent took several centuries, and in some instances, the interruption of internal evolution never allowed the process to mature. In Africa, there is no doubt that the societies which eventually reached feudalism were extremely few. So long as the feudal state was still in the making, elements that were communal coexisted with elements that were feudal, and with some peculiarities due to African conditions. The transition was also characterized by a variety of social formations. There were pastoralists and cultivators, fishing societies and trading societies, raiders and nomads. They were all being progressively drawn into a relationship with the land, with each other, and with the state, through the expansion of productive forces and the network of distribution. In feudal societies, there were clashes between the landlord and peasant masses, and later on, between the landlord and merchant classes. Under capitalism, the principal class contradiction inside Europe was between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Those hostile class relations provided the motive force within the respective societies. African communal societies had differences, such as age grades, and differences between ordinary members and religious leaders, such as rainmakers. However, those were not exploitative or antagonistic relations. The concept of class as a motive force in social development had not yet come about, and in the communal phase, one must look at the fundamental forces of production to understand the process of change. Using a number of methods and concepts, it is possible to reconstruct the most likely manner in which isolated family living was broken down and production increased. For instance, the rise of age grades can be seen as responding to the need for greater solidarity, because age grades included and cut across many families. Similarly, communal labor was entered into by cross-sections of the community to make work more efficient. The Dokpwe work group of Dahomey mentioned had a wider application in serving the whole community to perform such heavy tasks as clearing land and house building. With the offer of some food and beer or palm wine, a work team or work bee could be mobilized in a short time in most African communities, including those of the light-skinned Berbers of North Africa. Of course, while the organization of labor might have helped to produce more, The principal change in the productive forces was that which comprised new techniques, using the word in its broadest sense to include both tools and skills in dealing with the environment mid new plant and animal species. The first prerequisite for mastery of the environment is knowledge of that environment. By the 15th century, Africans everywhere had arrived at a considerable understanding of the total ecology, of the soils, climate, animals, plants, and the multiple interrelationships. The practical application of this lay in the need to trap animals, to build houses, to make utensils, to find medicines, and above all, to devise systems of agriculture. In the centuries before the contact with Europeans, the overwhelmingly dominant activity in Africa was agriculture. In all the settled agricultural communities, people observed the peculiarities of their own environment and tried to find techniques for dealing with it in a rational manner. Advanced methods were used in some areas, such as terracing, crop rotation, green manuring, mixed farming, and regulated swamp farming. The single most important technological change underlying African agriculture development was the introduction of iron tools, notably the axe and the hoe, replacing wooden and stone tools. It was on the basis of the iron tools that new skills were elaborated in agriculture as well as in other spheres of economic activity. The coming of iron, the rise of cereal growing, and the making of pottery were all closely related phenomena. In most parts of Africa, it was in the period after the birth of Christ that those things came about. The rate of change over a few centuries was quite impressive. Millet and rice had been domesticated from wild grasses just as yams were made to evolve from selected wild roots. Most African societies raised the cultivation of their own particular staple to a fine art. Even the widespread resort to shifting cultivation with burning and light hoeing was not as childish as the first European colonists supposed. That simple form of agriculture was based on a correct evaluation of the soil potential, which was not as great as initially appears from the heavy vegetation. And when the colonists started upsetting the thin topsoil, the result was disastrous. The remarks show that when an outsider comes into a new ecological system, even if he is more skilled, he does not necessarily function as effectively as those who have familiarized themselves with the environment over centuries, and the newcomer is likely to look more ridiculous if he is too arrogant to realize that he has something to learn from the natives. However, it is not being suggested that African agriculture in the early period was superior to that of other continents. On the contrary, African standards of husbandry on the land and with livestock were not as high as those independently evolved in most parts of Asia and Europe. The weakness in Africa seems to have been the lack of a professional interest in acquiring more scientific knowledge and in devising tools to lighten the load of labor, as well as to transform hostile environments into areas suitable for human activity. As far as agriculture in Europe was concerned, this professionalism was undertaken by the class with a vested interest in the land, namely the feudalist landowners and later the capitalist farmers. It has previously been stated that development is very much determined by the social relations of production, that is, those which have to do with people's functions in producing wealth. Where a few people owned the land and the majority were tenants, this injustice at a particular stage of history allowed the few to concentrate on improving their land. In contrast, under communalism, every African was assured of sufficient land to meet his own needs by virtue of being a member of a family or community. For that reason, and because land was relatively abundant, there were few social pressures or incentives for technical changes to increase productivity. In Asia, where much of the land was communally owned, there were tremendous advances in some types of farming, especially irrigated farming. This was because the state in India, China, Ceylon, and other places intervened and engaged in irrigation and other hydraulic works on a large scale. This was also true of North Africa, which in most respects followed a pattern of evolution similar to that of Asia. The African land tenure pattern was closer to that of Asia than to that of Europe, but even the most politically developed African states did not play the role of initiators and supervisors of agricultural development. One reason may have been the lack of population pressure, and hence the scattered nature of settlements. Another may have been state concentration on trading non-agricultural products to the exclusion of other things. Certainly, when African societies became linked up with other social systems outside the continent on the basis of trade, little attention was paid to agriculture. When it comes to the question of manufacturing in Africa before the time of the white man, it is also essential to recognize where achievements have been underestimated. African manufacturers have been contemptuously treated or overlooked by European writers because the modern conception of the word brings to mind factories and machines. However, manufactures means literally things made by hand, and African manufacture in this sense had advanced appreciably. Most African societies fulfilled their own needs for a wide range of articles of domestic use, as well as for farming tools and weapons. One way of judging the level of economic development in Africa 5 centuries ago is through the quality of the products. Here, a few examples would be given of articles which came to the notice of the outside world. Through North Africa, Europeans became familiar with a superior brand of red leather from Africa, which was termed Moroccan leather. In fact, it was tanned and dyed by Hausa and Mandinga specialists in northern Nigeria and Mali. When direct contact was established between Europeans and Africans on the east and west coasts, many more impressive items were displayed. As soon as the Portuguese reached the old kingdom of Congo, they sent back word on the superb local cloths made from bark and palm fiber, and having a finish comparable to velvet. The Baganda were also expert bark cloth makers. Yet Africa had even better to offer in the form of cotton cloth, which was widely manufactured before the coming of the Europeans. Well into the present century, local cottons from the Guinea coast were stronger than Manchester cottons. Once European products reached Africa, Africans too were in a position to make comparisons between their commodities and those from the outside. In Katanga and Zambia, the local copper continued to be preferred to the imported items, while the same held true for iron in a place like Sierra Leone. It was at the level of scale that African manufacturers had not made a breakthrough. That is to say, the cotton looms were small, the iron smelters were small, the pottery was turned slowly by hand and not on a wheel. Yet some changes were taking place in this context. Under communalism, each household met its own needs by making its own clothes, pots, mats, and such. That was true of every continent. However, economic expansion from there on was associated with specialization and localization of industry, people's needs being met by exchange. This trend was displayed in the principal African manufacturers, and notably in the cloth industry. Cotton fiber had to be ginned, separated from the seed, then carded and spun into yarn, before being woven. Either the yarn or the woven cloth had to be dyed, and the making of the dye itself was a complex process. There was a time when all these stages would be performed by a single family, or rather by the women in a single family, as in Yoruba land. But economic development was reflected in the separation of dyeing from cloth-making and the separation of spinning from weaving. Each separation marked greater specialization and quantitative and qualitative changes in output. European industry has been intensively studied, and it is generally recognized that in addition to new machinery, a most decisive factor in the growth of industry was the changeover from domestic production to the factory system, with the guild marking an intermediary stage. The guild was an association of specialists, passing on their skills by training apprentices and working in buildings set aside for that purpose. Africa too had elements of the guild system. At Timbuktu, there were tailoring guilds, while in Benin, guilds of a very restricted caste type controlled the famous brass and bronze industry. In Nupe, now northern Nigeria, the glass and head industry operated on a guild basis. Each Nupe guild had a common workshop and a master. The master obtained contracts, financed the guild, and disposed of the product. Both his own relatives as well as strangers were free to enter the guild and learn the various specialized tasks within the glass industry. What this amounted to was simply that there was increasing specialization and division of labor. Traditional African economies are usually called subsistence economies. Often small villages farmed, hunted, fished, and looked after themselves independently with little reference to the rest of the continent. Yet at the same time, the vast majority of African communities fulfilled at least a few of their needs by trade. Africa was a continent of innumerable trade routes. Some extended for long distances, like the routes across the Sahara, or the routes connected with Katanga copper. But in the main, it was trade between neighboring, or not too far distant societies. Such trade was always a function of production. Various communities were producing surpluses of given commodities which could be exchanged for items which they lacked. In that way, the salt industry of one locality would be stimulated, while the iron industry would be encouraged in another. In a coastal, lake, or river area, dried fish would become profitable, while yams and millet would be grown in abundance elsewhere to provide a basis for exchange. The trade, so readily distinguishable in every part of the continent between the 10th and 15th centuries, was an excellent indicator of economic expansion and other forms of development which accompanied increasing mastery over the environment. As part of the extension of trade, it was noticeable that barter was given way to some forms of money exchange. Barter was generally practiced when the volume of trade was small and when only a few commodities were involved. However, as trade became more complicated, some items began to be used as the standards for measuring other goods. Those items could be kept as a form of wealth, easily transformed into other commodities when the need arose. For example, salt, cloth, iron hose, and cowrie shells were popular forms of money in Africa, apart from gold and copper, which were much rarer and therefore restricted to measuring things of great value. In a few places such as North Africa, Ethiopia, and the Congo, the monetary systems were quite sophisticated, indicating that the economy was far removed from simple barter and subsistence. There were many other changes of a socio-political nature accompanying the expansion of the productive forces. Indeed, things such as agricultural practices, industry, trade, money, and political structures were inseparable, each interacting with the others. The most developed areas of Africa were those where all the elements converged, and the two socio-political factors which were the outstanding indices to development were the increase of stratification and the consolidation of states. The principles of family and deferment to age were slowly breaking down throughout the centuries preceding the arrival of Europeans and their sailing ships. Changes in technology and in the division of labor made that inevitable. The introduction of iron, for example, gave economic and military strength to those who could make and acquire it. Better tools meant more food and a greater population, but the latter tended to outrun the supplies of material goods, and the possibilities of wealth opened up by the possession of iron were seized upon by a few to their own advantage. Skilled workers in iron, cloth, pottery, leather, or salt-making tended to pass on their skills in closed groups known as castes. That ensured that the division of labor operated in their favor because their position was privileged and strategic. Iron workers were particularly favored in some African societies in which they either became the ruling groups or were very close to the top of the social hierarchy. The division of labor also carried over into non-material spheres, producing professional minstrels and historians. They, too, had certain special rights and privileges, notably the ability to criticize freely without fear of reprisal. In some circumstances, skilled castes were reduced to very low status. But that was rare, and in any case, it does not contradict the general assertion that the tendency was for communalism to give rise to more and more stratification. Social stratification was the basis for the rise of classes and for social antagonisms. To some extent, this was a logical follow-up of the previous non-antagonistic differences in communal society. For instance, old men could use their control over land allocation, over bride price, and over other traditional exchanges to try to establish themselves as a privileged economic stratum. Secret societies arose in the area that is now Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, and they permitted knowledge, power, and wealth to pass into the hands of the elders and ultimately to the elders of particular lineages. The contradiction between young men and their elders was not the type that caused violent revolution. But young men clearly had reasons for resenting their dependence on elders, especially when it came to such vital personal matters as the acquisition of wives. When disgruntled, they could either leave their communities and set up for themselves, or they could challenge the principles within the society. In either case, the trend was that some individuals and families were more successful than others, and those families established themselves as permanent rulers. Then age ceased to matter as much, because even a junior could succeed his father once the notion of royal blood or royal lineage was established. In the period of transition, while African society retained many features that were undisputably communal, it also accepted the principle that some families or clans or lineages were destined to rule and others were not. This was true not only of cultivators, but of pastoralists as well. In fact, livestock became unevenly distributed much more readily than land, and those families with the largest herds became socially and politically dominant. An even more important aspect of the process of social stratification was that brought about by contact between different social formations. Fishermen had to relate to cultivators, and the latter to pastoralists. There were even social formations, such as bands of hunters and food gatherers who had not yet entered the phase of communal cooperation. Often the relationship was peaceful. In many parts of the African continent, there arose what is known as symbiosis between groups earning their living in different ways, which really means that they agreed to exchange goods and coexist to their mutual advantage. However, there was also room for considerable conflict, and when one group imposed itself by force on another, the result was invariably the rise of social classes with the conquerors on top and the conquered at the bottom. The most common clashes between different social formations were those between pastoralists and cultivators. In some instances, the cultivators had the upper hand, as for instance in West Africa, where cultivators like the Mandinga and Hausa were the overlords of the RODNEY cattlemen right up to the 18th and 19th centuries. The reverse situation was found in the Horn of Africa and most of East Africa. Another type of clash was that in which raiding peoples took power over agriculturalists, as happened in Angola and in and around the Sahara, where the Moors and Tuareg exacted tribute from and even enslaved more peaceful and sedentary peoples. The result in each case was that a relatively small faction held control of the land and, where relevant, cattle, mines, and long-distance trade. It meant also that the minority group could make demands of the labor of their subjects not on the basis of kinship, but because a relationship of domination and subordination existed. In truly communal societies, the leadership was based on religion and family ties. The senior members of the society shared the work with others and received more or less the same share of the total product. Certainly, no one starved while others stuffed themselves and threw away the excess. However, once African societies began to expand by internal evolution, conquest, or trade, the style of life of the ruling group became noticeably different. They consumed the most and the best that the society offered. Yet they were least directly involved in the production of wealth by farming, cattle herding, or fishing. The ruling class, and the kings in particular, had the right to call upon the labor of the common man for certain projects and for a given number of days per year. This is known as corvée labor, from a similar procedure followed in feudal France. Such a system meant greater exploitation and at the same time greater development of productive resources. Social stratification, as outlined a moment ago, went hand in hand with the rise of the state. The notion of royal lineages and commoner clans could not have any meaning except in a political state with a concrete geographical existence. It is significant that the great dynasties of the world ruled over feudal states. To the European or European-trained ear, the names of the Tudors, Bourbons, Hohenzollerns, and Romanovs would already be familiar. Japan had its Kamakuras and its Tokugawas. China had its Tang and its Ming. India had its Guptas and its Marathas, and so on. All of these were feudal dynasties existing in a period some centuries after the birth of Christ, but in addition, there were dynasties which ruled in each of those countries before feudal land tenure and class relations had fully crystallized. It means that the transition to feudalism in Europe and Asia saw the rise of ruling groups and the state as interdependent parts of the same process. In that respect, Africa was no different. From a political perspective, the period of transition from communalism to feudalism in Africa was one of state formation. At the beginning and for many centuries, the state remained weak and immature. It acquired definite territorial boundaries, but inside those boundaries, subjects lived in their own communities with scarcely any contact with the ruling class until the time came to pay an annual tax or tribute. Only when a group within the state refused to pay the tribute did the early African states mobilize their repressive machinery in the form of an army to demand what is considered as its rights from subjects. Slowly, Various states acquired greater power over their many communities of citizens. They exacted corvée labor. They enlisted soldiers, and they appointed regular tax collectors and local administrators. The areas of Africa in which labor relations were breaking out of communal restrictions corresponded to areas in which sophisticated political states were emerging. The rise of states was itself a form of development, which increased the scale of African politics and merged small ethnic groups into wider identities suggestive of nations. In some ways, too much importance is attached to the growth of political states. It was in Europe that the nation-state reached an advanced stage, and Europeans tended to use the presence or absence of well-organized polities as a measure of civilization. That is not entirely justified, because in Africa there were small political units which had relatively advanced material and non-material cultures. For instance, neither the Igbo people of Nigeria nor the Kikuyu of Kenya ever produced large centralized governments in their traditional setting, but both had sophisticated systems of political rule based on clans and, in the case of the Igbo, on religious oracles and secret societies. Both of them were efficient agriculturalists and ironworkers, and the Igbo had been manufacturing brass and bronze items ever since the 9th century A.D., if not earlier. However, it can be conceded that on the whole, the larger states in Africa had the most effective political structures and greater capacity for producing food, clothing, minerals, and other material artifacts. It can readily be understood that those societies which had ruling classes were concerned with acquiring luxury and prestige items. The privileged groups in control of the state were keen to stimulate manufactures as well as to acquire them through trade. They were the ones that mobilized labor to produce a greater surplus above subsistence needs, and in the process, they encouraged specialization and the division of labor. Scholars often distinguish between groups in Africa which had states and those which were stateless. Sometimes the word stateless is carelessly or even abusively used, but it does describe those peoples who had no machinery of government coercion and no concept of political unit wider than the family or the village. After all, if there is no class stratification in a society, it follows that there is no state, because the state arose as an instrument to be used by a particular class to control the rest of society in its own interests. Generally speaking, one can consider the stateless societies as among the older forms of socio-political organization in Africa, while the large states represented an evolution away from communalism, sometimes to the point of feudalism. Again, it must be emphasized that a survey of the scene in Africa before the coming of Europeans would reveal considerable unevenness of development. There were social formations representing hunting hands, communalism, feudalism, and many positions intermediate between the last two. The remainder of this section will be devoted to a review of the principal features of several of the most developed societies and states of Africa in the last 1,000 years or so before Africa came into permanent contact with Europe. The areas to be considered are Egypt, Ethiopia, Nubia, Morocco, the Western Sudan, the interlacustrine zone of East Africa, and Zimbabwe. Each serves as an example of what development meant in early Africa and what the direction of social movement was. To a greater or lesser extent, each was also a leading force on the continent in the sense of carrying neighbors along the same path, either by absorbing them or influencing them more indirectly. Some concrete examples. Egypt. It is logical to start with Egypt as the oldest culture in Africa, which rose to eminence. The glories of Egypt under the pharaohs are well known and do not need recounting. At one time it used to be said or assumed that ancient Egypt was not African, a curious view which is no longer seriously propounded. However, for the present purposes it is more relevant to refer to Egypt under Arab and Turkish rule from the 7th century onwards. During that latter period, the ruling class was foreign, and that meant that Egypt's internal development was tied up with other countries, notably Arabia and Turkey. Colonized Egypt sent abroad great amounts of wealth in the form of food and revenue, and that was a very negative factor. But the tendency was for the ruling foreigners to break with their own imperial masters and to act simply as a ruling elite within Egypt, which became an independent feudal state. One of the first features of feudalism to arrive in Egypt was the military aspect. The Arab, Turk, and Circassian invaders were all militarily inclined. This was particularly true of the Mamluks, who held power from the 13th century onwards. Political power in Egypt from the 7th century lay in the hands of a military oligarchy, which delegated the actual government to bureaucrats, thereby creating a situation similar to that in places like China and Indochina. Even more fundamental was the fact that land tenure relations were undergoing change in such a way that a true feudal class came on the scene. All the conquerors made land grants to their followers and military captains. Initially, the land in Egypt was the property of the state, to be rented out to cultivators. The state then had the right to reappropriate the land and allocate it once more, somewhat like the head of a village community acting as the guardian of the lands of related families. However, the ruling military elements also became a new class of landowners. By the 15th century, most of the land in Egypt was the property of the sultan and his military lords. If there was a small class which monopolized most of the land, it followed that there was a large class of the landless. Peasant cultivators were soon converted into mere agricultural laborers, tied to the soil as tenants or vassals of the feudal landlords. These peasants with little or no land were known as the fellahin. In Europe, there are legends about the exploitation and suffering of the Russian serfs, or mujik under feudalism. In Egypt, the exploitation of the fellahin was carried out even more thoroughly. The feudalists had no interest in the fellahin beyond seeing that they produced revenue. Most of what the peasants produced was taken from them in the form of tax, and the tax collectors were asked to perform the miracle of taking from the peasants even that which they did not have. When their demands were not met, the peasants were brutalized. The antagonistic nature of the contradiction between the feudal warrior landlords and the fellahin were revealed by a number of peasant revolts, notably in the early part of the 8th century. In no continent was feudalism an epic of romance for the laboring classes, but the elements of development were seen in the technology and the increase of productive capacity. Under the patronage of the Fatimid dynasty, science flourished and industry reached a new level in Egypt. Windmills and water wheels were introduced from Persia in the 10th century. New industries were introduced: paper making, sugar refining, porcelain, and the distillation of gasoline. The older industries of textiles, leather, and metal were improved upon. The succeeding dynasties of the Ayyubids and the Mamluks also achieved a great deal, especially in the building of canals, dams, bridges, and aqueducts, and in stimulating commerce with Europe. Egypt at that time was still able to teach Europe many things and was flexible enough to receive new techniques in return. Although feudalism was based on the land, it usually developed towns at the expense of the countryside. The high points of Egyptian feudal culture were associated with the towns. The Fatimids founded Cairo, which became one of the most famous and most cultured cities in the world. At the same time, they established the Azhar University, which exists today as one of the oldest in the world. The feudalists and the rich merchants were the ones who benefited most, but the craftsmen and other city dwellers of Cairo and Alexandria were able to participate to some extent in the leisured lives of the towns. Ethiopia. Ethiopia, too, at the start of its history as a great power, was ruled over by foreigners. The kingdom of Aksum was one of the most important of the nuclei around which feudal Ethiopia eventually emerged, and Aksum was founded near the Red Sea coast by a dynasty of Sabaean origin from the other side of the Red Sea. But the kings of Aksum were never agents of foreign powers, and they became completely Africanized. The founding of Aksum goes back to the 1st century A.D., and its ruling class was Christianized within a few centuries. After that, they moved inland and participated in the development of the Christian feudal Ethiopian state. The Ethiopian, Tigrian, and Amharic ruling class was a proud one, tracing its descent to Solomon. As a state which incorporated several other smaller states and kingdoms, it was an empire in the same sense as feudal Austria or Prussia. The emperor of Ethiopia was addressed as conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, elect of God, emperor of Ethiopia, king of kings. In practice, however, the Solomonic line was not unbroken. Most of the consolidation of the inland Ethiopian plateau was carried out in the 12th century by an intruding dynasty, the Zagwe, who made claims to descent from Moses. The Zagwe kings distinguished themselves by building several churches cut out of solid rock. The architectural achievements attest to the level of skill reached by Ethiopians, as well as the capacity of the state to mobilize labor on a huge scale. Such tasks could not have been achieved by voluntary family labor, but only through the labor of an exploited class. A great deal is known of the superstructure of the Ethiopian Empire, especially its Christianity and its literate culture. History was written to glorify the king and the nobility, especially under the restored Solomonid dynasty, which replaced the Zagwe in 1270 A.D. Fine illuminated books and manuscripts became a prominent element of Amharic culture. Equally fine garments and jewelry were produced for the ruling class and for the church. The top ecclesiastics were part of the nobility, and the institution of the monastery grew to great proportions in Ethiopia. The association of organized religion with the state was implicit in communal societies, where the distinction between politics, economics, religion, medicine was scarcely drawn. Under feudalism everywhere, church and state were in close alliance. The Buddhists were preeminent in feudal Vietnam, Burma, Japan, and to a lesser extent in China. In India, a limited Buddhist influence was overwhelmed by that of the Hindus and Muslims. And of course, in feudal Europe, it was the Catholic Church which played the role paralleled by the Orthodox Church in Ethiopia. The wealth of Ethiopia rested on an agricultural base. The fertile uplands supported cereal growing, and there was considerable livestock raising, including the rearing of horses. Craft skills were developed in a number of spheres, and foreign craftsmen were encouraged. For instance, early in the 15th century, Turkish artisans settled in the country and made coats of mail and weapons for the Ethiopian army. Coptics from Egypt were also introduced to help run the financial administration. No one denies that the word feudal can be applied to Ethiopia in those centuries, because there existed a clear-cut class contradiction between the landlords and the peasants. Those relations grew out of the communalism that had characterized Ethiopia, like other parts of Africa, much earlier. Feudal Ethiopia included lands that were communally owned by village and ethnic communities, as well as lands belonging directly to the crown. But in addition, large territories were conferred by the conquering Amharic dynasties on members of the royal family and on soldiers and priests. Those who received huge areas of land became Ras, or provincial princes, and they had judges appointed by the emperor attached to them. The peasants in their domain were reduced to tenants who could earn their living only by offering produce to the landlord and taxes to the state, also in produce. The landlords exempted themselves from tax, a typical situation in feudal societies, and one which fed the fires of revolution in Europe when the bourgeois class grew powerful enough to challenge the fact that the feudalists were using political power to tax everyone but themselves. Ethiopia, of course, never reached that stage of transition to capitalism. What is clear is that the transition to feudalism had been made. Nubia. Nubia was another Christian region in Africa, but one which is not so famous as Ethiopia. In the 6th century A.D., Christianity was introduced in the Middle Nile, in the districts once ruled by the famous state of Kush or Meroe. In the period before the birth of Christ, Kush was a rival to Egypt in splendor, and it ruled Egypt for a number of years. Its decline in the 4th century A.D. was completed by attacks from the then expanding Aksum. The three small Nubian states which arose sometime afterwards were to some extent the heirs of Kush, although after their conversion to Christianity, it was this religion which dominated Nubian culture. The Nubian states, which had consolidated to two by about the 8th century, achieved most from the 9th to the 11th centuries, in spite of great pressures from Arab and Islamic enemies, and they did not finally succumb until the 14th century. Scholarly interest in Nubia has focused on the ruins of large red brick churches and monasteries, which had murals and frescoes of fine quality. Several conclusions can be drawn from the material evidence. In the first place, a great deal of labor was required to build those churches, along with the stone fortifications which often surrounded them. As with the pyramids of Egypt or the feudal castles of Europe, the common builders were intensely exploited and probably coerced. Secondly, skilled labor was involved in the making of the bricks and in the architecture. The paintings indicate that the skills surpassed mere manual dexterity, and the same artistic merit is noticeable in fragments of painted pottery recovered from Nubia. It has already been indicated that the churches and monasteries played a major role in Ethiopia, and this is worth elaborating on with respect to Nubia. The monastery was a major unit of production. Numerous peasant huts were clustered around each monastery, which functioned very much as it did the manner of a feudal lord. The wealth that accumulated inside the churches was alienated from the peasants, while the finest aspects of the non-material culture, such as books, were accessible only to a small minority. Not only were the peasants illiterate, but in many cases they were non-Christians, or only nominally Christian, judging from the better-known Ethiopian example of the same date. When the Christian ruling class of Nubia was eliminated by the Muslims, very little of the achievements of the old state remained in the fabric of the people's daily lives. Such reversals in the historical process are not uncommon throughout human experience. Ultimately, the dialectic of development asserts itself, but some ebbing and flowing is inevitable. The Nubian states were not in existence in the 15th century, but they constitute a legitimate example of the potentialities of African development. One can go further and discern that Kush was still contributing to African development long after the kingdom had declined and given way to Christian Nubia. It is clear that Kush was a center from which many positive cultural elements diffused to the rest of Africa. Brasswork of striking similarity to that of Meroe was reproduced in West Africa, and the technique by which West Africans cast their brass is generally held to have originated in Egypt and to have passed on by way of Kush. Above all, Kush was one of the earliest and most vigorous centers of iron mining and smelting in Africa, and it was certainly one of the sources from which this crucial aspect of technology passed to the rest of the continent. That is why the Middle Nile was a leading force in the social, economic, and political development of Africa as a whole. The Maghreb.
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.